The fuel protests that shook Tony Blair's government are ending, but their effects on everyday life are far from over, and their political impact may be lasting. As most of the protesters at the refineries decided they'd made their point, Tony Blair said there'd be no short-term fix on fuel taxation. Petrol retailers warned that restocking filling stations could take a fortnight. The blockades at refineries and oil depots weren't all lifted at once. Stanlow was the first at 5 o'clock this morning. Next came Grangemouth at 7:30. And by this evening, 8 more major blockades had ended. But depots in Grays, Corriton and Hythe are still being picketed tonight. And the problems at the pumps are still far from over. Shell say that only 230 of their 1,100 stations have petrol tonight. BP say 300 out of their 1,500 outlets have supplies. For total, the figure is 136 out of 1,400. Esso have only 70 out of 1,600 stations supplied. Texaco say they'll have refueled almost 500 of their 1,500 outlets within the next 48 hours. Tonight we have reports from around the country on how much petrol is available and how schools, shops and hospitals are coping. First, Nicholas Witchell on how the protest ended.
It ended where it began, a people's protest which had caught a government off guard. But in the dawn outside the Shell refinery at Stanlow in Cheshire, they decided their point had been made.
After deep discussions and concern amongst ourselves about the distress to the British public, we have decided to end our protest as of 5 p.m. this morning. AM, sorry.
The truckers began to withdraw, and the word spread to Britain's other refineries that the protest was over, at least for now. Oil tankers began to roll again in significant numbers, taking fuel to 300 specially designated priority filling stations. At Grangemouth, the refinery which supplies most of Scotland, there was some reluctance to lift the blockade and a warning that it could be resumed.
We've won this debate, and hopefully it will be noted in the Cabinet, and we'll find that out in the budget, and if not, we'll be back.
And that message of defiance was repeated at refineries across the country. The government has 60 days to cut fuel tax, otherwise
we can be back with a phase 2, which is already plans drawn up, and we'll be there twice as big, twice as strong, with the public support again, I hope.
Britain's roads remained uncharacteristically quiet. But as some petrol reached some pumps, there was a rush to fill up. And from weary filling station staff, a sense of frustration that it could all have been avoided.
People here do have sympathy with the whole cause. The fuel has gone too high. And it's sad that Gordon Brown didn't take 5 pence off the fuel 3 weeks ago, and I don't think any of this would have happened.
And then, just as things seemed to be sorting themselves out, in stepped several of the oil companies with a price rise. Esso raised the price of petrol by 2 pence a litre. Motorists couldn't believe it, the government couldn't understand it. At 4:30, Esso announced a climb down, the price rise had been cancelled. Being readied for action, some 80 military tankers, which are being used to move fuel from military sources to essential services such as hospitals. Tonight, across Britain, the evidence that the worst of the fuel crisis is over. Time for reflection, for the government on a week when it was shaken, and for the motorist on a confrontation which many of them supported.
Well, I'm glad it happened, but also I'm glad now that it's all over, and hopefully something can get done about it.
It's something that's had to happen, really. The taxes of this country are all out to kilter.
I give credit to those people who caused the disruption for backing off now when they haven't upset too many people, but I don't think we've solved anything.
Fuel is moving again, but only to the 300 specially designated priority filling stations, and most of it only for priority customers. It's reckoned that it will take 2 days to get a basic service restored, and possibly 2 weeks before everything is back to normal. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
The tankers may be rolling out of most of Britain's oil depots, but a few protesters are still hanging on. Our special correspondent Gavin Hewitt spent the day at the Purfleet oil depot in Essex to see who was at the protest and why they too eventually decided to give up.
At Purfleet, a crucial fuel terminal for London, the protesters were divided. John Mackeldon, an arable farmer from Kent, felt they'd delivered a stinging rebuke to the government and it was time to leave.
I do not really feel that we can put the public to any more inconvenience. We've had their support and we've been so grateful for that.
But others, particularly those who own their own trucks, were less certain. Then, mid-morning, they heard that Esso had raised its petrol prices. To these men, it undermined all they'd been fighting for.
Very angry, very angry.
And how will that affect your decision as to whether you're going to continue the blockade here?
Oh, we're definitely staying, definitely.
Why should we leave here paying more for our fuel than what we started, what we come here to protest about?
So the picket line remained. The police cars were waiting to escort the tankers, but the protesters wanted to check the drivers' paperwork to ensure the fuel wasn't going to the general public.
Yeah, but no, what's it for? Is it going for, is it for the emergency services to get the fuel?
It's close to, I understand, gentlemen, that this site is actually close.
During the day, only 7 tankers left this plant, and they were heading for filling stations selected by the government for essential services only.
What's been happening here during the day is that the protesters have been contacting others around the country by phone, trying to get them to renew the blockades. It's an indication of just how fragile this situation remains. Then, late this afternoon, Esso bowed to popular opinion and reversed its price rise. But for some of the protesters, that still wasn't enough.
As far as we're concerned, the government still needs to budge on this.
Purfleet remained one of the few fuel depots with protesters outside. But in the past half hour, they held a meeting and decided to withdraw. So ending one of the last protests in Britain's taxpayers' revolt. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Essex.
Tony Blair promised today he would listen to the demonstrators, but he said the government wouldn't be bullied into changing its policies. The opposition leader William Hague said the Prime Minister should apologise to the nation. Our political correspondent John Pienaar on the political fallout of the fuel crisis.
The police checkpoints around Westminster tonight, symbols of a government under siege. They may not be needed for much longer, but what's getting through now are the accusations that Labour lost touch with the mood in the country, that this crisis should never have happened. Earlier, another prime ministerial appearance, this time to claim personal responsibility for facing down the protest and the credit for succeeding.
For a Prime Minister to have decided to yield to a protest such as this would not just have set a precedent that the country would in time bitterly regret, but it would have demonstrated a disregard for the proper process of democracy that I personally am not prepared to contemplate.
The tone had changed. This was about regaining ground after seeing Labour caught on the hop so badly. For the protesters, a glimmer of hope.
Of course we will listen. Indeed, as a result of listening before the last budget, we removed the fuel duty escalator and introduced certain measures, both for hauliers and motorists. But of course we accept that since then there has been a rise in the price of petrol.
No such magnanimity for the oil companies, though, especially after the news, today of all days, of a short-lived price rise.
I really can't understand the Esso action. I mean, the world oil price, as far as I'm aware, has actually come down in the last few days.
The oil executives had been in for another talking to, and no one was saying much afterwards. Nothing about the price rise, not much more about the other big complaint, that they'd done so little to get fuel out, it almost looked like collusion with the protesters.
Mr. Brendan, the oil industry has been accused of colluding with the protesters. Is that true?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Was the Prime Minister angry with you this afternoon?
Bad-mouthing the oil companies isn't what William Hague's doing. Naturally enough, he's after the government.
I think the government do need to say sorry to the people of this country because they brought about this situation. It is government policies that brought about this situation and brought the country to a grinding halt over the last few days.
An emergency recall of Parliament looks much less likely now, but it's already clear tonight that a lot of Labour MPs and ministers will soon be pushing at the Chancellor's door, demanding concessions in the next budget to damp down public dissent before it reignites. After Tony Blair's big hint today, expectations of a concession are running high. Labour MPs like to believe that they're good at reading public opinion. They're saying there's still time to rewrite this story.
What we have to address in the budget is the concern that all members of Parliament will have that reflects the concern in the community about fuel prices. We have to balance that with the other needs of the government, including the environmental needs, which people also want met in some way. So it's a complex area, but I don't have any doubt that we will address this, and we will address it in the reasonably near future through the normal processes.
The impression of a remote government out of touch with the public has hurt Labour. Senior politicians are admitting they have to learn from their mistakes. They can't afford to repeat them. John Pienaar, BBC News, Westminster.
Early this morning, the BBC joined a tanker driver as he pulled out of the Stanlow refinery in Cheshire, which was the first to end the blockade. The tanker was heading for filling stations in the nearby St Helens area. Our North of England correspondent Richard Wells watched the first delivery take place.
He hadn't been to pick up fuel at Stanlow for a week. He wouldn't have considered driving through the picket line. But within hours of the protest ending, Wally Glover joined a long line of tankers and drivers thirsty for work. Getting in was easy, but it wasn't long into his 45-minute journey to St Helens before traffic jams began to form.
It's probably a queue for petrol on the motorway services.
The Prime Minister had argued that the crisis had been caused because drivers like Wally had been intimidated by demonstrators. Had he been threatened?
No, no way. Nothing like that at all. Never had any trouble with them lads at all. First-rate bunch of chaps. Behind them every step of the way.
Ahead of him, St Helens. His load is not for those in essential services, but for the public. And word spread quickly that fresh fuel supplies were on the way.
Some cheer you're on, you know. You just take it as it comes. It's really delighted to see you. The only trouble is they block all the pumps up. You can't get in with the stuff that they want.
People queued for up to an hour for just £20 worth.
Pump one, wait behind pump number one.
There was relief, but no obvious resentment about the blockades.
I think they should have hung out longer. Put more pressure on the government to put the prices down.
Yes, very desperate. I've been shopping this morning on a bike. That's how desperate I've been.
In one brief moment on Merseyside this afternoon, half the petrol stations were open. Many then closed. Demand had emptied the pumps once again. Here it's been the busiest day ever.
I've never ever seen anything like it in real life. I mean, it's just been all hands on deck since this morning. None of us have hardly spoke to each other. It's just on and on and on. We just keep swapping roles, just give each other a break here, there and everywhere, really.
Yeah. A long, tiring day for Wally Glover, and more long, tiring days to come. He reckons Merseyside won't have sufficient petrol this weekend. It'll be next weekend before things are back to normal. That's 10 days away. Richard Wells, BBC News, St Helens.
The fuel emergency closed more than 80 schools in England and Wales, and some hospitals were forced to cancel non-urgent operations. As you've heard, the government has designated 300 petrol stations where workers from essential services will be given priority access to fuel to try to keep the country running. The 29 categories of priority users include the armed forces, police and fire services, workers in health and social services, pharmaceutical supply, food manufacture and distribution, and transport services. A work identity card will be required. Our social affairs editor Neil Dixon looks at how schools and hospitals, transport and shops are coping tonight.
So that it means that you don't have to come to school tomorrow.
As the crisis rumbles on, there are more innocent victims. This Essex primary school is one of 4 in the county to close down today because teachers can't make it to work. More closures are expected next week unless the situation improves. If the parents here are anything to go by, it's not the protesters who are being held responsible.
Totally Tony Blair's fault. The man is totally responsible for this. He's caused total chaos because he thinks it's the protesters that are actually having a go about the petrol. It's everybody.
It's the government's fault. He's not listening, is he? He's not listening to us.
I've got work to go to myself tomorrow. It's going to disrupt me tomorrow and Monday. Very concerned indeed.
In the Kinnan Valley in South Wales, the classrooms lie empty. 18 comprehensives have been closed down here, thousands of children sent home. These pupils reckon they're the unluckiest in Wales. Their school has its own buses, so for now they're the only ones in the region not enjoying an unexpected break.
It's bad, real bad.
I'd rather it wasn't open, but if you've got enough fuel, then there's no reason why it should shut.
They certainly won't shut the hospitals, but throughout the country the health service is feeling the pressure. At King George's in Essex they've stopped all routine operations other than those for cancer. More than 30 have already been cancelled, and it's also becoming more difficult to get patients home. The scheme, which gives doctors and nurses priority for fuel, should help, but hospitals need a whole range of staff to function, and many of them rely on public transport to get to work.
We need to get into the hospital, or domestic staff, or administrative staff, and if we can't get those staff into the hospital, then the hospital just won't run.
And finding a bus to get to work is becoming more difficult. Edinburgh's largest operator stopped running services at 6:30 tonight, and they're predicting more problems tomorrow. In the northwest, Arriva has fuel for 2 days, and this London bus company had to suspend services altogether today until fuel arrived this afternoon. The supermarkets say panic buying is the cause of empty shelves. In some stores, milk sales are up 80%. Bread is also in strong demand, and here in Plymouth, they've had to introduce rationing. For now, though, the NHS is perhaps the biggest worry, a cause of concern for both patients and relatives. This operating theatre for day cases lies idle. There won't be any routine surgery here for the next few days. Like the rest of the public services, the NHS is struggling to cope, and it looks like things will get worse before they get better. Neil Dixon, BBC News, at King George's Hospital in Essex.
Now for the latest developments, we join three of our correspondents. Richard Bilton in Staffordshire, where farmers who took part in the protests are thinking about their next move. Margaret Gilmore in Cornwall on the availability of petrol there. But first, Andrew Castle at the refinery in Grangemouth, where the tankers are now on the move. Andrew, how many tankers are leaving Grangemouth tonight, and how long before Scotland is back to normal?
Well, the tankers are moving in and out freely tonight. About 600 tankers will have gone in and out of these gates since 5 o'clock this morning by midnight. That's about 2/3 of the normal daily traffic, according to BP, and they say they're putting on extra shifts to move even more fuel out to the garages. But it's a slow process, and we're told that it could be the middle of next week before supplies return to normal. And in the meantime, around 100 protesters have come back to the Grangemouth refinery to continue the protest.
Andrew, thank you. Margaret Gilmore in Cornwall. Is petrol getting through yet to anyone other than essential services there?
Absolutely, Peter. Behind me here, rather an unusual sight, a garage serving petrol and diesel and no real queue of cars. Further down the road, we've had another garage just closed, not because it's dried up, but due to lack of custom. So a patchy picture, a lot of garages still closed, but an increasing number now serving fuel to the public.
And briefly, Margaret, are shops getting their supplies through?
Well, the big supermarkets have been getting their normal deliveries, but panic buying, stockpiling means that they have been running out of essentials by lunchtime. The smaller shops not getting all their deliveries, and they predict it'll be the middle of next week before their shelves are full again.
Margaret, thank you. Richard Bilton in Staffordshire. What's the, how do you read the mood of the farmers and hauliers there who've given up their protest?
And you can hear the clapping behind me. We have about 250 farmers and hauliers. Nominally, this is about feedback and why the blockades ended today, but really it's about the next stage, the next push forward for this group. So far, the protesters have been fragmented. This is a coming together for the next push. There's been much talk from the floor of being united and the ball being in our court. One expression that keeps coming forward is 60 days. 60 days for the government to come up with a solution, 60 days for this group to reorganise. They're aware of the French deal. It was mentioned a lot tonight, the way the government worked with the hauliers, and they are after a similar deal. They want to use the pause, as they see it, for today to move forward and get some sort of deal within the next 2 months.
Richard Bilton in Staffordshire, thank you. As protests here draw to a close, demonstrations across other parts of Europe continue. Lorry drivers in Spain, Germany and Belgium have blocked roads and refineries. Our Europe correspondent Justin Webb on the protests on the continent.
From the air, as far as the eye could see, Belgium today was at a standstill. Some of Europe's busiest traffic arteries were utterly blocked. Among the targets, the port of Antwerp, Europe's second biggest, all road access severed. The militants on the ground were holding out for the same reduction in fuel duties that their colleagues won a week ago in France, but the mood among governments seems to have hardened. Belgian ministers offered concessions on social security payments that brought the signing of a peace deal with moderate unions. But on the crucial issue of cutting fuel duties, Belgium's Prime Minister, echoing Tony Blair, said no.
Nous comprenons les aspirations et les problèmes des chauffeurs de camions.
We understand the aspirations and problems of the lorry drivers. I think the government has shown itself to be very reasonable, and now it's the drivers' turn. I think the patience of the Belgian people is at an end.
That's the line taken by leaders around Europe today, and it seems to be working. Here in Germany, farmers did block an oil refinery, but only for a short time. Big protests are planned tomorrow in Spain and Ireland, but those governments too are unimpressed. And this evening here in Brussels, the militants broke up in some chaos. Their leaders called the action off to the disgust of a few hardliners. They claim the war goes on, but this battle has been lost. The trucks move at midnight. The Belgian government had a choice. It could take the French line and effectively buy off the protesters, or the British one and stand firm. Today it decided to stand firm, and this evening that policy appears to have paid off. Tomorrow these streets will be full of traffic. Justin Webb, BBC News, Brussels.
Now, briefly, the rest of today's news. America's First Lady, Hillary Clinton, has taken part in her first televised debate in the race to become a New York senator. Mrs. Clinton was embarrassed by her Republican opponent, Rick Lazio, who forced her to answer questions about her husband's affair with Monica Lewinsky. Our Washington correspondent Stephen Sacker reports.
New York politics isn't polite, it's a scrap, and Hillary Clinton is taking some heavy punches.
You know, a New Yorker would never have made that proposal.
Republican Rick Lazio jabbing at Mrs. Clinton, the out-of-town opportunist. The polls show them neck and neck, so she's painting him as an ally of ultra-conservatives like Newt Gingrich.
He stands here and tells us that he's a moderate, mainstream, independent member of Congress. Well, in fact, he was a deputy whip to Newt Gingrich.
Mrs. Clinton, you, of all people, shouldn't try to make guilt by association.
Even more awkward for the First Lady, a video clip was played of her protesting her husband's innocence at the beginning of the Lewinsky scandal.
That is not going to be proven true.
Regrettably, it was proven true. Do you regret misleading the American people?
I've tried to be as forthcoming as I could given the circumstances that I faced. Obviously, I didn't mislead anyone. I didn't know the truth.
No sympathy from Rick Lazio. He turned to fundraising and demanded Mrs. Clinton sign a pledge to limit campaign cash.
Here it is. Let's sign it. This is the New York Freedom from Soft Money Pact.
It was an aggressive stunt which ended with them toe-to-toe, but Mrs. Clinton was having none of it. After the bout, no handshake, Hillary Clinton still the candidate all Republicans love to hate.
Her 8 years as First Lady have been far from easy, but Hillary Clinton is now discovering that running for the Senate is even tougher. Stephen Sacker, BBC News, Washington.
Here, the Ministry of Defence said tonight that the commander of the 11 British soldiers kidnapped in Sierra Leone made a grave mistake in diverting from his authorised route into the hands of the West Side Boys. Major Alan Marshall of the Royal Irish Regiment now faces disciplinary action. The 3 appeal court judges considering the case of the Siamese twins known as Jodie and Mary have finished hearing evidence and are expected to give their verdict next week. Doctors want to separate the girls to save the life of the stronger twin Jodie, but the parents have appealed against the decision because it would mean certain death for Mary. The case has similarities to one in America, where Siamese twin girls are now both thriving after a successful operation to separate them. David Willis has been to talk to the family in Arizona.
There you go, Joe.
From the other side of the world, Jeff and Michelle Roderick have been following the Court of Appeal case closely. Their twin daughters, Shauna and Janelle, were once one, sharing each other's liver, breastbone and diaphragm. The couple's strong religious beliefs placed them in a remarkably similar and equally agonizing dilemma to the couple in England. They agreed to have the twins separated after hearing it was their best chance of keeping one child alive.
We knew there was a risk we could lose one or both. But we also knew that the best possible life was not going to be conjoined. It just wasn't going to be. And so we accepted those risks in order to give them the opportunity to have the best possible life.
When they were born 4 years ago, doctors said the twins would never be able to walk and may not even be able to crawl because of the way they were attached to each other. They shared the same circulation, so that when one got an infection, it automatically transferred to the other. When one had a tantrum, the other turned white as the blood was drained from her. They were separated in a complex 7-hour operation, which, as well as costing nearly £1 million, almost cost Shauna her life. Just like the case in England, religion was a crucial factor. Knowing no one who'd been in a similar position, Jeff and Michelle canvassed the views of fellow members of their local church and decided it was better to save one life than lose two. Their prayers are now devoted to the couple at the centre of the English court case.
I feel for them, I really do. I mean, my heart goes out to them losing one, you know, but I think I would feel worse if I lost both. I really would. I would at least have one of them that, you know, I would always wonder how they would turn out. And since they're identical, they're going to turn out the same.
They acknowledge, though, that for other parents, the moral and ethical considerations may be more complex. When the Rodericks faced their dilemma, they did so alone, which is why they're now setting up a support group for families who find themselves in a similar situation.
To take every life.
This family's prayers were answered. Shauna and Janelle face further surgery, but doctors say there's a good chance that both of them will survive. For the family back in England, it seems, that is sadly not a possibility. David Willis, BBC News, Arizona.
It's just hours to go before the opening of the 2000 Olympics, and Australians have lined the streets in their thousands to welcome the flame of the 27th Olympiad. But as our sports correspondent Adam Minot reports, the identity of the person who will actually light the stadium torch is being kept a closely guarded secret.
Shortly after dawn in Sydney, the Olympic torch, which was lit in Greece 4 months ago, crossed the Harbour Bridge, carried by the Australian sporting legend, the golfer Greg Norman. It is now on the final leg of its journey to the Olympic Stadium. The progress of the torch has gripped a nation, which is revelling in its responsibility of hosting the Games at the turn of the millennium. Other sporting greats, like the Australian golden girl of the 1960s, the swimmer Dawn Fraser, have been part of the relay. And on the steps of the Opera House, another Australian superstar, Olivia Newton-John, ran her 400 yards before passing the torch onto the tennis player Pat Rafter. The citizens of Sydney have thronged the streets. Any lingering cynicism about the Olympics after the corruption crisis, which has dogged the movement for the past 2 years, seem to have been put to one side. In these closing hours before the opening ceremony, there's growing suspense and excitement about who will do the job done by this man in Atlanta 4 years ago.
This is me, the greatest of all time. Singing for the first time, give a good look.
Muhammad Ali is in town, like everyone who's anyone, it seems, for what Australians are saying is the biggest party the world has ever seen. After 7 years of preparations, now just 24 hours till the Olympics begin, and the people of Sydney and Australia say they're going to put on the best games ever. Adam Minot, BBC News, Sydney Harbour.
Now back to tonight's main news. The fuel protests are ending, but their effects are far from over. Petrol retailers say restocking filling stations could take weeks, at least 2 of them anyway. Tony Blair says his government will listen, but he won't be bullied. Our political editor, Andrew Marr, joins me now from Downing Street. Andrew, have ministers yet clocked what's hit them, the nature of this revolt?
Well, I think they have. They now accept that although there were militants involved, of course, basically this was a genuine tax revolt. If you like, it was a kind of good-humoured version of the poll tax uprising of a few years ago, but much, much better organised and connected. One cabinet minister told me rather ruefully tonight, look, if the miners had had mobile phones, they'd have won.
And could we be seeing a sort of political sea change as a result of of those perceptions that ministers now have?
Well, we're seeing the first short-term effects already. There's the first snapshot poll is coming out in the Daily Telegraph from Gallup tomorrow morning, and it shows the government taking a knock. It shows Tony Blair's own competence ratings quite sharply down. Interestingly, the Conservatives not getting any benefit at all at the moment. Longer term, the real question, however, was this week the moment when indirect taxes became as sensitive and difficult for governments as income tax has been for a very long time. So-called stealth taxes stumbling out into the daylight and suddenly not looking so clever after all. And if that's the case, then it really matters for the overall economic atmosphere.
Andrew Marr, thank you. And there will be the very latest on the end of the fuel crisis.